Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss spatial turn in communication. This lecture is part of your paper on community media and society. This lecture will help you to understand the need for a spatial turn in understanding communication and community. As you know, although the idea of spatiality has been well recognized in media and communication studies, however, it lacks an articulation in communication theory. As a result, it becomes extremely problematic. The term spatiality remains at best as a metaphor in communication. As communities are transcending place and space, our way of engaging with communication needs to address the spatial turn in communication. Through this lecture, you learn that community has extended beyond physical proximity and congregation. This has been possible due to changing forms of media technologies. Conventional theories of communication do not provide theoretical comfort to engage with the changing dimensions of place and space, as these terms are becoming fuzzy and fluid along with new media technologies. Scholars have commented and observed this transformation. The present lecture attempts to argue and finds a theoretical promise to conceptualize a spatial turn in communication and community on the basis of recent contributions in the field of communication. Our sense of community and space, be it through media, photographs, maps, and drawings, are a process of mediation, and that is brought to us through spatial experiences. Although it has been well registered, but lacks articulations and theorization in communication studies. Conventional notions of communications are caught between binaries, that is, either between time or space. This binary has governed our thinking and human life. Accordingly, our understanding of communication and community are within the confines of individual, group, and place by taking household and individuals as the unit of analysis in real time. In the process, it undermines the role and possibility of media technologies that can reconfigure the distinction between time and place and space. Since time has been the major emphasis in communication studies, that is, we map changes in communicative behavior in real time and place due to the impact of media technologies, our notion about place is fixed and forecloses any imaginary possibility that media technologies can offer in our renewed understanding of society and community. In recent years, much has been discussed, debated, and written about cultural flows, deterritorialization, beyond boundary, and so on in communication studies with the advent of globalization. Scholars have immensely contributed to understand culture, modernity, and the transnational engagement with community. Besides, scholars, through ethnographic details, explored media practice and flows in the community. These contributions have enriched our understanding about the recent transformations in the field of communication. However, conventional scholarship on communication does not provide sufficient theoretical apparatus to engage with such changes. These developments show a definite shift from the conventional framework of communication, although few efforts have been made by scholars to link both and situate it in its historicity. However, it has not been much of fascination to conventional media theorists of mass communication, who are more concerned with the functionality of the medium rather than its implications at the cost of occluding a large set of dimensions that communications may offer. The question arises, how do we understand the changes in our society with the help of such conventional models of mass communication, nor these models, as you know, it ever grew in our locale or technologies developed in our society. Neither there is a checkered history of these media in our society, so that historians may engage with the study of media history over centuries. However, we may not deny that the forward march towards modernity has placed all of us in the similar fate in a relative manner, that is, to consume technology. Hence, any understanding of communication in our society makes us to study the impact and its desired consequences through media technologies. But the impact study helped us to know one side of the story, that is how media influences and impacts our society, but not about how people use and appropriate such technologies in their everyday life. Due to paucity of research and temptations of the new, our research is prioritized with the flow of the time or at the cost of neglecting a holistic understanding of communication. Nevertheless, one can draw insight from studies conducted elsewhere. Harold Innis' seminal work provides an interesting starting point to understand the linkage among communication, power, and knowledge from historical vantage point. Innis' work attempts to capture the transformation from the ancient civilization till the developments in the 20th century. Although this work seems to be ambitious in its approach to cover such a vast range of time frame, however, the most significant contribution of this seminal work may be understood in terms of process and knowledge of communication. Innis makes a distinction between time-biased and space-biased media. In the former category, he refers to stone and clay, which have heaviness and durability. In the latter, he refers to papyrus that may be transported and light in nature. Both the dimensions have different connotations and implications in society. While time-biased media fulfilled and legitimized the religious ambitions of the empire, the space-biased media fueled the expansionist agenda of the military empire. Although such distinctions may sound oversimplified, however, there is a merit to it. As Raymond Williams highlights, it not only emphasizes the technological assets but also study media as cultural forms. The lesson to learn from such classification is that there is an overt emphasis of spatial concerns in the industrial modernity, thereby neglecting values and traditions. In fact, in his comments that commercialism being a product of industrial modernity has killed the sense of time and led to an ephemerality of communication. Although this statement sounds benign in contemporary times, however, might have relevance in the early days of industrial capitalism. Probably, Innis did not observe the dimensions of speed in space-biased communication, hence his conclusion. Scholars in the later part of 20th century have noticed this element with the advent of new media technologies, as Matla have provided a different way to engage with new media technologies with its sense of instantaneity. These technologies, with the help of their symbolic flows, can transcend any geopolitical space, what Zygmunt Bauman captures as a shift from solid to liquid modernity. In the earlier distinction between time and space bias media becomes blurred with a renewed meaning of material and symbolic fluidity. While the term symbolic remains within the domain of mediation to reinforce the material, on the contrary, with the advancement of transportation technology, the idea of space-biased communication is legitimized and globalized. How do we understand space in the present context? As Christian Fuchs highlights that it is a territory of a system, the field that is produced by and enables interaction. The space of the interactions of two friends comprises their bodies, the physical surroundings, and the interaction medium if communication does not take place face to face, but is organized with the help of a technical medium such as the Internet. Then the space of interaction is comprised by bodies and a technical environment that enables spatially distanced communication. It shows that space may not be equated with proximity. Along with media technologies, the idea of space may be stretched across geographical distance. Besides, we have to make a distinction between natural and social space. While natural spaces are dissipative and autopoietic system, social spaces are created by human activities in social processes. They incorporate and transform natural spaces. Humans enter into metabolic processes with certain parts or regions of nature that become part of society in the form of ecosphere. Each social system has its own space, and that is, it is based on transformed parts of nature, created artifacts, and human bodies that are related to each other at a certain distance. Anthony Giddens has a different take on the idea of space. Giddens tries to localize the idea of space with the help of discussions on social activity that comprises of both space and time. For Giddens, the idea of locale is the way we use space in social activity so that the idea of fixity may be attributed to social interactions. Conventional theories of social sciences, are more particularly communication studies, do not provide theoretical comfort as they immerse and emphasize on context. Today, these contexts have outgrown, but our theories of communication have not addressed the changed circumstances except modifications to understand the changed context. It equally demands for a paradigm shift in understanding communication. Term is transmission model. Now, conventional theories of media and communication, such as transmission model, became a mental signpost for media scholars for decades, with an antiquated definition of mass communication by Lasswell. Lasswell formulated this theory within a structure functionalist tradition to understand the structures that contributed to make the society functional through mass media. Lasswell developed this theoretical tradition during the war context to understand information flow outside and inside so as to make communication predictable and surveillance possible within society. Later, scholars added dimensions to understand implications to bridge the gap between the source and receiver of communication by developing ways to connect feedback from the audience to the source so as to make it an autopoietic system. The idea behind this notion is to read communication as a system. There are checks and balances at every level so as to avoid discrepancy and confusion. Anything outside circularity of this system is treated as miscommunication. We live in a society where miscommunications reach much faster than communication through formal channels of communication. In a way, as rightly pointed out by scholars, that the transmission view of communication is concerned with the linear extension of messages in space. Ritual view of communication, although one finds critique of North American tradition of transmission in the scholarly writings of Carey as ritual view of communication, however, such writings may not be read as critique per se, except add certain dimensions that were underplayed by the earlier transmission traditions of communication. Since the transmission tradition does not engage with a social structure where communication needs to be grounded, the ritual view emphasizes the need for grounding communication with the help of participation, communion, and sharing. According to Carey, a ritual view of communication is directed not towards the extension of messages in space, but towards the maintenance of society in time. Not the act of imparting information, but the representation of shared beliefs. Carey's view may not be directly in opposition to transmission model of communication, except it attempts to ground it that may be referred as from text to context. Much emphasis was given to the analysis of the text during the 80s and 90s with the help of ideas borrowed from literary theory and semiotics. Communication theory immensely benefited from such analysis by engaging deeper to the hidden meanings in encoding and decoding of text. Although such readings are useful, however, they are confined to the locations in which such readings are possible. These locations are confined within the territory in which media is viewed, read, and consumed. The post-90s witnessed a dramatic turn whereby, through transnational television, we received text, images, and later, through internet, we received continuous images and text from across the world. Today, the distinction between text and context are blurred and interrogates the very epistemological foundations of communication. Besides blurring of text and context and producer and consumer, our understanding of mobility needs rethinking. Conventional media research attempts to study media practices within a narrow confine of context resulting from the domestic sphere where the idea of mobility is fixed. These studies have not addressed the idea of mobility of communication except try to capture audience or consumer in a captive manner to fulfill its hidden interest and to predict communicative behavior for the purpose for which such communication has been addressed. We live in a time where we consume when we are on the move. For instance, the urban cityscape is filled with billboards, kiosks, adverts. Besides, the urban soundscape where you hear songs through vehicles. We spend considerable time in navigating in the city. We also consume varieties of messages, songs, and cross through various signposts and adverts during our travel. We consume when we are on the move. John Berger aptly puts it by saying that these images are continually passing us like express trains on the way to some distant terminus. It becomes more complicated when we combine mobility of people along with mobile technology. Such technology makes redundant the earlier notion of traveling culture of the past. Earlier, we carried books and magazines when we travel. Now they are part of the bygone era. We can now access all of them through our mobile and tablets as a portable culture, like carrying other accessories with us during our travel. The distinction between the present one from the earlier one may be referred as it is attached to our moving body John Woody is concerned to study John Woody talks about mobilized society, has received significant attention in social sciences as it raises the issue of text and context which may alternate the positions. We observe a gradual convergence in text and context due to media technologies. Such convergence not only allows us to rethink and interrogate conventional way of understanding production and reception of communication, but also the distinction between public and private domain in communication. Finally, the idea of interactivity needs scrutiny, as interaction has shifted from a physical congregation to online spaces. Our ways of thinking and feeling about interaction needs to be revisited. Along with digitization process, now the conventional media also is undergoing transformation, as convergence of technologies have created the possibility of two-way interaction. Such interactions interrogate the conventional notion of audience, producer, and participant, as conventional understanding of communication made a clear distinction due to the nature of technologies used. Accordingly, they framed the term audience as a term was always considered as a term which was meant for duped, passive, massified. The later generation scholars, of course, talked about the active meaning of audience. However, that does not sufficiently qualify the audience to break the niche of consumption and production of communication. Along with convergence, mode of interactions are changing. Our conventional thinking about text and context that need to be problematized. Need for a spatial turn. From the earlier discussions, we observe that much thinking and analysis has been invested in understanding the conventional, existing, and the emerging patterns of communication, its implications on space and time, producer and consumer, nature of interactions and interactivity. Understanding such variations also force us to reckon with differing perspectives that transcend conventional scholarship. As such, scholarship govern the horizon of our thinking and analysis. We live in a time when our disciplines, ideas, perspectives, and finally technologies are converging. This convergence equally demands our attention to rethink about the compression of space and time. The more there is compression, the renewed our perspective becomes to understand the meaning of communication. This renewed meaning of communication is possible due to spatiality. Although we realize the importance of spatiality in communication, but we do not realize the geographical implications of communication. Nor communication studies embraces the discipline of geography and its contributions to communication studies. In fact, the very idea of transportation meaning of communication is derived from political geography. However, with Industrial Revolution and telegraph, the idea of transmission replaced the earlier terms such as transportation. The idea of geographical configuration is very much part of our conventional understanding of communication. However, we have not given due recognition to geography of communication as a subfield within communication studies, nor teach the importance of geography to students of communication. One of the reasons for lack of articulations may be due to engagement of conventional communication studies with medium rather than society. The medium under scrutiny was confined to a territorial sense of community, and the idea was to understand the efficiency of communication within the geopolitical sense of community. How do we understand the current notions of flows in a conventional framework that transcends spatiality and geopolitical sense of community? In fact, Castells highlights that the disjunction between two spatial logics, that of everyday living and that of dominating space, is a fundamental mechanism in controlling society. This disjunction is clearly visible as our negotiation with social construction of images, reasons, landscapes, community and nations take place. Hence, spatial context may be viewed as both a physical surrounding and a social construction that shape the images, hierarchies and representations of everyday life. In fact, some of the recent writings, such as Joshua Merowi's seminal work, outlines how electronic media changes perceptions of space and contributes to the alterations of social roles and communities. And Benedict Anderson's contributions engage us to rethink nation states as imagined communities. We live in a time where some of the old media is becoming redundant and new media is configured. The distinction between the old and the new, while the former, such as railway, telegraph, confined to the national territory, the later ones, such as internet and the other new media, are transcending national territory. These media are constantly redefining our sense of time and place. While summing up, we can say that the terms such as deterritorializations, media flows, mediascape have added new meaning to communication that may not be addressed within conventional framework of communication studies. We live in an era where not only media flows from outside but also from inside to the outer world. This is possible due to the rupture between production and consumption of communication due to new media technologies. We can consume it wherever we go with the portable media technologies that can transcend barriers of territory, community, and nation. Today, the new media technologies help us to plan our activities in a personal manner. Besides, it gives us immense scope for a media mix to integrate all media at the same time with a speed so that an idea of proximity is felt. All these activities are possible due to media technologies that can transcend reason, community, locale, and finally nation state. Hence, a spatial turn in communication offers promise and prospect to rethink about communication. Do attempt all the questions in the self-evaluate quadrant. For further reading suggestions, please refer to the third quadrant. Thank you.